Welcome back to Chapter 1 of Sherrill's textbook. We are going to skip page 16. We've covered 15. You can look at 16 on your own. That's stuff that you can read and understand without a lot of explanation. I would like to spend more time on page 17 and following talking about important concepts from idea. Um, these are important, they're new to you, and they need a little more time. So I'm going to use 15 minutes to allow this flip to take care of that. The first one is called first person language. First person language deals with putting the person before the disability. If you see an article that talks about autistic children or Down syndrome children or that type of thing, you hear the disability first, then it's inappropriate. You're not talking about the person first, you're talking about the disability. The person isn't that disability. The person is a person and they have a disability just in case. So if I'm talking about my son Seth, who has Down syndrome, or your cousin who has cerebral palsy, maybe your uh, Johnny uses a wheelchair. So it's that person first. It's making them an individual, not a disease, and it's important to get that right. Now, the only time you don't use the disability after the person is when you're talking about somebody who's deaf. Deaf, the culture sees itself as another linguistics group, as you would have somebody who speaks English or Chinese or Spanish. So they don't have a disability, they have a different culture that uses sign language uh, because of their deaf. So you would say a deaf person, and you would use a capital D when you did that. So keep that in mind. It's really important when you see things. I'd like to spend a lot of time here with it, but I can't. Just remember, a person is a person, and when it's not absolutely necessary, you don't have to identify them. When I talk about my son, who's great at all things he does, if it's important, then I need to mention he has Down syndrome. If not, it's just my son, and we went fishing the other day. Enough on that. There's disability categories. There's 13 listed on the next page. These are the ones that most often diagnosed and used with disabilities, so you should be familiar with those. I'm not going to go over them right now, so I'm going to let you read with them. You have special education services on page 18, and I'm going to let you read the first part. What I want to start with is individual family service plan. When a child is born with a disability, they automatically qualify for services. If they acquire a disability before their age of 3, they are entitled to a service, and that service from ages of birth to 3 is covered in the Individual Family Service Plan, the IFSP. So my son was born with Down syndrome. He automatically qualified for a individual family service plan because he had a disability. Once you're diagnosed under the age of 3, then a caseworker will come and they will help you get the benefits you need. First Steps here in St. Louis is one of those organizations, and they will help you work with your child to the age of 3. At the age of 3, they actually become part of the school district, the school system, and are no longer entitled to the individual family service plan. At age 3, they start developing an IEP. An IEP is a legal document that must be followed once it's established and signed by everybody that sets up how this child will interact in the education system. So you will sit down with a team. It could be the teachers, the principal, the therapist, the gym teacher, anybody who's in charge of that child's education, including the parents, and anybody advocate they would need to bring in, music therapist. They will sit down and put together a learning plan every year for that child. And as a team, the better the team, the better the plan, uh, will decide what goals they want that child to try to achieve. how much time will they be in the classroom as opposed to the self-contained classroom? Will they have adapted PE or will they have inclusive PE? And we'll talk a lot about those terms. But the IEP starts at the age of 3 and will continue on until that child's out of school, and it usually ends with graduation or the age of 21. An IEP is from ages 3 through 21, or if they graduate earlier, is no longer in place. Okay, within the IEP, the next thing we're going to talk about is least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment means that we're going to put this child, this individual, into the learning environment that they best function in. If they have very little cognitive delays, we wouldn't want to put them into a self-contained classroom or put them in a school that only has children with disabilities. They would probably be in the regular classroom without an aide, doing regular work, and maybe a resource person coming in once in a while, maybe helping them with speech, whatever the case may be. Maybe the least restrictive environment is in that self-contained classroom. The team decides this child learns best in a group of his peers or her peers, and they work in that classroom with special ed teachers, and maybe they go to lunch and recess with their classmates. There may be some who struggle with their disability to the point they can't make it to the public school system. They would be in a special school itself where a person might be hurting themselves, might be in danger to others. They would work in that system. The least restrictive environment is finding the right spot for that child to achieve. Uh, my son has Down syndrome. Children with Down syndrome learn by following examples. They observe and watch. So if you put them in a classroom that struggles with a lot of people who have behavior issues or learn lower than they will mimic that. But if you put them in an atmosphere where they can watch people and mimic people doing better than they do, they will mimic the higher um, material. And that's just an example. Other disabilities have the same thing. So you want them to be in the classroom, the setting that is not too hard or too simple for that child. It needs to be the right setting to help them achieve. You have to be careful because a lot of times school systems struggle with finances, and they may not want your child in the self-contained, the regular classroom, the inclusion room, because maybe it requires that they have an aide with them every day. Aides cost money to the school district. So you may have to fight to get your child or that child into in a regular classroom with a shadow that would help your student achieve. Sometimes that shadow needs to be there step by step by step. Maybe an aide working with an individual with autism would have to be there to coach them step by step. We usually have an ABA therapist is what they're called. And they would be just focusing on helping that child. Well, the child got to the point where they just needed redirection once in a while, then that aide can go help other people and then come back. Or they might get to the point where they don't need that aide at all. So hopefully that helps you understand what the least restrictive environment is. Okay, there are transition ages, transition services. We talked about one when your child is born with a disability 0 through 3. They have the individual service plan, and then the IEP from 3 to the time they're done with school. Well, when you leave that IFSP and go to an IEP, there's a transition period at 3. It's not talked a lot about, but there is a transition period as you go from 3 into the school system. So keep that in mind. The other transition services that are emphasized much more often and much more important, but take a lot more energy, is called the transition at 16, and that it has to be in place by 16. A lot of times they'll start working on it at the age of 14, and the law says in place by 16 or earlier if appropriate. Remember to keep that phrase, earlier if appropriate. So usually we'll start in different states. About the age of 14, we'll start working on it. It must be in place and complete by 16. And this helps the child prepare the individual prepared to leave the school system and go into society where they will be working in transportation, buying for themselves, living type things. So that transition period of 14 done by 16 is a transition period. Okay? So I really wanted you to focus on those concepts, and we will cover the other pages. Um, Actually, I want you to read the other pages on your own. They don't need a lot of explanation that you can't pick up by reading the case studies. And then you can email me if you have questions on those pages. Well, go back and listen to this one again, memorize this material. The ISFP is very important. The transition period is TP is the initials for it, transition period. Remember, it's at 3 and also at 14 must be done by 16. The IEP is a legal document. If a child is supposed to have 5 minutes of this work and you make it 7 and take away work from somewhere else, you've broken the law. If they're supposed to be in a self-contained classroom and you're putting them in an inclusion room, you've broken law. That document is legal and binding, and you must make sure you understand that and follow that to the T. And it takes the team to change most of the changes in an IEP. So good luck with this chapter, and we'll see you in the next chapter.